So I'm in front of the camera. Are you happy? For one, ignore that. I'm talking to myself. Yes, actually. That's a long story. So, where do I start? I'm trying to solve the answer of life and everything, I guess. How do I actually explain this? Formation of a person. A couple things we know about people. So, like one example, human brains are continually developing to some certain dimensions until like mid-20s, which is when you get typical like fully formed frontal cortex. So we know a couple of other things about people. I guess they're it's such a weird, fucking convoluted, complicated topic. So what about people is up to their control? What about people can they change, and what is outside their power to control? This is basically sort of like a vector that we need to have a. I think we still have much further to go in terms of figuring out what those are and how those things play together. So, if we were to take a few vectors that I think are fairly, I don't know they're well known or if they're agreed upon, but let's say if I'm going to start with a few vectors. Okay, so start this all over. So what I'm trying to figure out is what vectors are inherent, meaning part of you as an individual, part of your genetic code, things you can't actively change specifically. Things you can't actively change specifically. What parts of you are environmental, which is to say how the environment affected you physically and mentally. To what degree do those things impact your formation, and at which vectors and timelines can those things be altered, or do they become baked in enough of the superstructure that they might as well be inherent and intractable? So let me give one example of inherent personality. Right, you're born orderly or you're born not orderly. That one's pretty straightforward. If we're talking about environmental that's baked, most children, if they aren't properly socialized between ages 2 and 4, that has long-lasting, typically lifelong consequences. So that's something that's environmental, and it's an occurrence. It's like an experience, but it's an experience specifically at a point and at a level of interaction when you're first building things that it becomes so intrinsically baked in that you can't undo not being properly socialized between 2 and 4. Like maybe you can to some degree, but it's very not to the same level that you won't be able to operate at the same level at age 30 if you are not properly socialized between ages 2 and 4 as if you were properly socialized at age 2 and 4. That's a good way of thinking of it. And you'll never be able to compensate that effect fully no matter how much effort you put into it. Probably, something like that. Then there's other environmental things there's lots of environmental factors like that. And then there's sort of where does that become an environment, where do all those things meet up and mesh together that they become this thing that is now actively a tool that you are using to make active decisions, and you can make decisions differently, but still having to operate within the confines and constraints of the tool set that you have. Okay, so part of what I'm trying to understand is which things are what, first off, like what qualifies as one of those things, right? Because we know personality is a vector that you're born with. We know your morphology, whether you're like an endo, ecto, or meso, to some degree, is something you're born with, and you can modify and change that a little bit, but you can't make your shoulders be broader by working out, right? And like not really. You can't make your legs be longer, So your morphology that has some aspect contributory to how you develop psychologically. And to be clear, all this stuff is I'm talking about how these contribute to your psychological formation long term. So you have your personality, you have your morphology. These are things that are by and large outside of yours or the environment's control after you've already been formed. If, I'm not talking about environment, what your mother eats. Maybe it's going to change your morphology. I don't know about all that. I'm not talking about that, though. Interesting topic, though. Really hard to track and prove ideas, though. So you have your personality. You have your morphology. Those are things that you're actively born with. You have your gender. That's something that you're actively born with. So whether or not you're male or female. I don't know what all other things you're born with, but that's some of them. Then you have some of your environmental things that are going to be your foundational bake-ins. Good way to think of it is like you can do whatever you want with eggs, but once you've actually like cooked the egg, it's kind of cooked and you can't uncook it, right? So what are the environmental things like the socialization from 2 to 4? What are those aspects? So you have aspects like environment in terms of, are you around other children, what your family structure is, are you nuclear, are you blended, are you what's extended, I think is one of the other terms. Like basically what's the composition of your family. The composition of your family, I think, has a great deal to do with your thing that ends up being baked to the point that you can't control it. Right, if your father isn't around a lot, that does things to you that are outside of your control, and it's difficult, if not impossible, to modify the consequences of that by the time you're an adult. So there's those, right? Environment in terms of like what the actual like cultural identity of things are. So what sort of like beliefs you're brought up to believe, to which I don't know, because you kind of can change those to some degree. So I don't know whether or not those qualify. So just to give some context, why I'm sort of rambling here is because I'm trying to figure out what all things qualify for these, and how they function, how they work together. Like how do you turn these into trackable, predictable metrics? I guess is a good way to say it. So let's take something like morphology, right? Endo, ecto, meso. Depending on which of those you are, it's going to have some sort of influence and impact on how you form and grow up, right? I think anybody that says it's irrelevant whether or not you're, squatty and fat has no bearing whatsoever on the formation of your personality through your youth and adolescence than if you were tall and trapezoid and muscular. I think anybody I can't imagine anybody thinks that. Well, no, I can't imagine some people think that, but they're stupid and wrong. So let's not talk about them. So, right, that's a thing that matters. So it's to what degree does that affect you, and like what is the vector of it, right? So just like give you a real easy example of how this sort of like manifests. I mean, it's pretty obvious in the descriptions, but just in case, for sake of argument, if you're short and fat and squatty, you will be less popular, probably less well liked for the raw virtue of your physical appearance than you would be if you were taller and more muscular. So that will have, I think, drastic consequences into how you are formed psychologically and where you end up putting focus and how you end up adapting to your socialization. Being big and strong and fast and like pretty enough but when people look at you, they think high school quarterback. The way that you grow up is different than when they look at you, they think short, dumpy nerd, right? Those are just fundamentally different, and they make you develop differently. So, and personality is very much the same. So part of what I'm trying to think of and sort of figure out is what are all the attributes that are relevant? And I'm not going to be able to think of all of them, but what are enough of them that I can start to get some kind of picture that if I translate this into sort of like a mathematical formula, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but what are enough of them that if I package them in a way to understand how they all interact with one another and what the output product is, what is enough of those based on our current understanding that it's as close to as far as I can go in understanding this, and simultaneously will be useful for someone after me that has better measurements, better tools, better understandings to actually lead into a point of figuring out more of how this actually works in a way that you can legitimately, figure out what parts were incorrect, figure out what parts were missing, actually start to use it into like a measurement or a formula or a metric, right? Like, because I don't think I'm going to be able to figure that out, but I think maybe I can construct enough of a framework that gives enough of a sort of picture that it will allow somebody else to see how to answer it, maybe. And so anyway, that's where my head's working at. So what I mean by like sort of like the measurement. Well, because first, like, you have to understand properly how to conceptualize the things, right? So the measurement and how you translate the math, that's its own individual problem, but it's also how do you actually measure and understand a thing. So I'll give you an example. Neuroticism. Neuroticism is being prone to negative emotion, right? Okay. Is that what that is, strictly speaking? I don't think it is. I don't think that's what neuroticism is. I think... But what's weird about it is I don't think it operates necessarily on a scale. So if you think of people who have the attribute of neuroticism somewhere in a percentile grouping, so you're in the 40th percentile of neuroticism. That means you're more neurotic on average than 40% of the population, right? Okay. So you might think if you're going from 0, or the 0th percentile, you might think you're over here on the top end of the distribution at the very beginning of almost being impossible for you to experience negative emotion. Then you might start thinking as you get closer to the 50th percentile, you start dipping down into like this valley. That's like you're somewhere in between like the two different values. And then as you get over here to the 100th percentile, you start going actually up to where pretty much all you experience is negative emotion. So you might think neuroticism is something you can measure like that. There are two peaks and a valley that connects them between the two. But I don't think that's proper, which is kind of why I don't think neuroticism is just propensity to experience negative emotion. I think it's it's probably more accurate to think of neuroticism as something like a sliding scale that functions more like degrees on a compass, maybe. So, like a 360 view. So like, say if you're in the 40th percentile, that's like it's more like your neuroticism heading is 220. It makes sense to me. So I'm sure if somebody else is bothering listening to this, they understand what I mean by that. But I don't know if that's strictly right either, because if we just take the construct of personality, right, and you say, okay, neuroticism is a set of, sort of like compass facing coordinates, and you say that's the same for everything, that's how you end up with like this generalized archetypical sort of like evaluation. That's what Myers-Briggs does. So like if you say you're 220 on neuroticism and then you're 110 on conscientiousness, you might say, oh, those two directions start to converge, and eventually if you put in all the personality traits, you find eventually you're heading northwest, which is similar to how Myers-Briggs ends up with, like, you're the architect or you're the whatever. And so I don't think that's strictly right either. But what I do think is right is I think there's some proper way to conceive of the difference between being at the 0th percentile of neuroticism and the 100th percentile of neuroticism, that there is a measurement between those 2 points. And I don't know if the measurement curves, if it's a wave, if it's flat. I'm not entirely sure, because I'm not entirely sure how to conceptualize neuroticism per se. Because like I said, if it's just propensity to experience negative emotion, then it's basically just a slide scale, right? Like it probably starts to go up exponentially at the other ends. But I don't think that's how it works. So part of the problem I'm trying to grapple with here and understand is, like, how does it work? What is it? So another way of like sort of phrasing this and putting it is 0 percentile neuroticism has an obvious impact to how you exist as a person. 100th percentile neuroticism has an obvious impact to how you function as a person. I think potentially 50th percentile has the same degree and amount to which it impacts how you function as a person. Right, I don't think the attribute is just a measurement between two extremes. I think there's I don't know, I'm not entirely sure. There's probably something that I could start to understand about chemistry or math that I would start to get some concepts of what might be good models for this, but I'm not sure what the models are for it. But I assume once there's a good understanding of what neuroticism is, and we understand how the measurement works between the extremes, then it's how do we combine those together to figure out what is the qualitative vector adjustment for a person based on all these attributes. Because you got a couple different things going on here, right? So like neuroticism doesn't exist in a silo, for one. Like that's part of why I don't think neuroticism is explicitly propensity to experience negative emotion, because I think neuroticism has a direct corollary and influence with how it interacts with openness, for example, or how it interacts with conscientiousness. And I think all those things make something fundamentally different depending on where they are on the scale. So what I mean by that is neuroticism, if it's at the 68th percentile, it doesn't always operate identically between everybody that has neuroticism at the 68th percentile in terms of like their propensity to experience negative emotion, for example, right? And you might say that some people have figured out a trick of that or how to use that, but I also think it's directly related to some of these other attributes I'm talking about, which is, what's your morphology, what's your family structure, what are your other personality attributes, and how do those things actually coalesce into one thing. It's sort of like saying, yeah, you can say that like hydrogen exists as hydrogen. It's like if you can separate it like that, sure, but I don't think neuroticism can be properly conceptualized as something that can exist on its own like hydrogen. I think neuroticism is more like something that's always water, and it can't be anything else. If we were to say that the only two traits and vectors were neuroticism and openness, I would say neuroticism can't ever be hydrogen on its own. It always has to be water. Like it doesn't know how to be separated from those bonds. But it doesn't mean that you can't figure out what sort of like the measurement, like the valences of it, how it works and how it functions. And that requires a proper definition and understanding the measurement scale. But once you get that, then you package up personality together, figure out how that interacts with morphology, and there's like this math equation that explains how those things relate. And it's almost like it gives you like a score or a vector that you understand how it starts to interact with environment, social hierarchy, construct, family type. What I'm getting at is if there is, I think, some way to say, if you understand what a person's psychological traits are in specific regard to their personality, you know what their morphology is going to be because you can like control for it somehow, right? You know what their environment, sociocultural, is going to be, and you know what their family archetype unit is going to be. I think there is a way to take those things and sort of convert them into values that you put through an equation that you can actually get a good snapshot of who the person is and how they respond to most things by the time they're age 25. There's obviously, lots of different control factors in there that you're going to be off plus or minus to some orders of magnitude because, maybe they don't meet their dream partner, or maybe they do, and maybe that goes well, and maybe it goes badly, and there's all sorts of things that can cause big divots and changes in there, but I don't think it will be several orders of magnitude off, no matter what the experiences are past that. If you assume personality is stable, which it is, if you assume morphology is generally stable, which it is, you can assume that the sociocultural environment is going to stay roughly the same, and you assume that their family structure is going to stay roughly the same. I think you can probably figure out a way to figure out what all those vectors are, calculate them all against one another, and you can have a good idea of who that person's going to be, how they're going to respond, and how they're going to act. And the whole reason any of this shit even matters in the first place is because what is it each person is supposed to do? What's our function that we're supposed to perform, right? Because this is going into my whole, sort of concept, and I think that there's enough understanding this that people get this to some degree, but I haven't seen any hardcore papers on it or seen it in any literature about, say, evolutionary psychology or anything like that. Maybe it's there because I haven't read it all. I haven't read very much of it, to be honest. I've watched a few things in snippets because that's how I parse data. That's how I look at things. I like go through all your math, show me the finished problem. And in lots of ways, when you show me the answer, I sort of understand the math that you use to do it, just like intrinsically. Don't know how I do it, but I kind of do that somehow. So what's the point I'm getting to? There was a point and I lost it. Oh, so in the way human beings are sexually dimorphic, and like we're explicitly sexually dimorphic, like by design, as much as evolution is by design, right? And there's clearly like separated distinct roles and functions, and like you don't get people that are born both male and female as a norm, right? The structure of the species is around us having two genders. So in that in that sort of fashion, in that sort of mindset, I think that the species is geared explicitly towards having multiple different. We're psychologically polymorphic in our personality, specifically by design. And when I say by design, I mean by design to the same level that we're sexually dimorphic by design. I mean, it's the same sort of. And what's weird about that is I'm not sure how that would work, because I don't know we have the tools to understand how that would work. Because when you think of something like oh no, I guess that actually does kind of make sense how that would work to some degree, maybe. Sorry, I'm sort of answering this question in my head as I've been asking it. Like there are natural balancing features for how many men and women there are, for example. So what was interesting to me is if we are psychologically polymorphic, if that is a thing, and like we are that by design, and it's part of the species, and we're supposed to operate with separate distinct jobs into levels, there must be some leveling balance mechanism that makes that all work right, so you don't get too many people that are this certain aggregation of traits, and you don't get too many people that are these other certain aggregates of traits. You get the mix that you need as much as you're able to. So it's got to be, I'm thinking it's some advanced version of how being sexually dimorphic autocorrects itself. You have lots of men go off to war. You come back, there's 4 women to every 1 man, because lots of the men got killed. And what ends up happening is men end up reproducing with multiple women. Most of the men do. And it probably continues like that on, because generally speaking, the rate of birth, I think, generally across the species is 50-50. I don't know if it would be interesting if that's not the case and there is actually an adaptive thing, but I don't know of anything that suggests there is. I don't know. That's complicated. But, eventually you start to sort of just generally breed to where you get into like roughly 50% men, roughly 50% women. And if you ever get to the opposite circumstance to where, say, there's 4 men to every woman, well, the men start killing each other until there's only 1 man for every 1 woman. So like there's autocorrective methods in terms of like the math and over time for how we revert back to a mean of sexual dimorphism, right? So I think there's got to be some equally in place but probably drastically more complicated mechanism for how the psychological polymorphism is adapted to that. I'm just not sure what it would be, because it would have to be, I don't know, maybe it's really simple and really elegant, but when I think about it, like I can't imagine how it's not just ridiculously complicated for how that works. Like probably past the point that we have some concepts or measurement tools of how we even understand that. But I'm fairly convinced that's the case. I think we are as designed with autocorrecting measures to be psychologically polymorphic as we are to be sexually dimorphic. And that's not something I've really heard anybody say or give any sort of legitimate credence to, but I'm pretty sure that's accurate. I'm pretty sure. I'm pretty fucking sure that's accurate. There's just no possible way I can prove it or actually, justify that argument to anybody that actually understands the science and the space, which I understand and I get is a problem for obvious reasons, but we might not have the science or understanding to understand how that actually works, but it's like, okay, well, what's your argument? Like, you say that there's something we don't understand, but you do, but you can't prove it how, right? Like, that's not an argument anybody's going to listen to. But safe to say, I'm pretty sure that's how it works, so I won't dwell on that anymore. So part of, and if that's the case, it's how do we how do we obey the nature of that so we can learn to command it? Like, we have some mechanisms in place for understanding how we functionally treat the genders differently. Like pregnant women. Like there's lots of convention on how you deal with pregnant women that some of it is universal and cross cultural. So there's some of it that's genetically inherent that a lot of us understand to some degree how you treat or protect pregnant women, like it's inherent in us. If you're a big, strong man, generally speaking, people understand that, like, if there's a fight, you're the one that's going to do it. Like there's this separation of responsibility and tasking to the point that we're actually built for the differential of tasking, which is why only the females are the ones that have children. And typically speaking, if you want to send a bunch of people to war, you send them in, right? So in that light, if that's how we specialized sexually, I think we're specialized psychologically the same way. I think some of us, are meant to be the seers, are meant to be the shamans, are meant to be the workers, are meant to be the leaders, are meant to be all these different things to some degree. And it's just a question of how does that all actually function and work together? And in part, it's, how does it work together so we can just understand how it works in the first place, so we can get people more sort of aligned with what their purpose is. But it's also, what? Sunshine. You okay, girl? You okay? You just having a bad dream, girl? Yeah, you're all right, girl. I'm here. I got you. That's my girl. It's like the hydrogen water thing, right? It's like, how do we understand how that works to the point that we can actually command it? Which is interesting and daunting as a proposition, because, like, even watching people talk about gender now, it's like, holy shit, man, how are we fucking up that conversation so bad? It's like gender isn't a thing. People can be any gender they want. Like, women can do everything as good as men, and men can do everything as good as women. Like, that's just, we are built to do things differently. Even if we do the same thing, to some extent we do it differently because of how gender influenced our decision making. There are so many things about it that are just so integrated to every way that we think of and adapt to things. Like, so I don't know that I can't imagine somebody in my lifetime being able to master something like how all this psychological polymorphism can be understood and mastered and turned to our advantage in the same way we understand how to use noble gases versus, carbon. Just watching what's going on with conversations about gender, like, I can't imagine. That's two. That's like a binary. So it's like, if we can't do that, Jesus Christ, how are we ever going to do that with, like, personality? But the thing is that's interesting about that is because I think the thing that they're sort of arguing about and trying to figure out between their, there's infinite genders. So, first off, no, there isn't. But I think part of what they're actually trying to get at, the thing they don't understand, is they're more trying to say that to some extent there's infinite personality, which they're kind of right, but it's like, but even if you had a man that had personality values and vectors that were identical to a female's personality and vectors, the way that they would represent and embody those personality vectors would be different because of the flavorhood of masculinity or femininity on top of them. Like, it doesn't, whatever, like, I'm not going to justify that for 38 days. It's something most 5-year-olds know the answer to, so I'm just constantly bedazzled that we can so catastrophically fuck it up trying to answer a question. Anyway, it's what are the things that work together and how do they work? So what are the parts that are intrinsic, inherent, like, your personality, your morphology? What are the things that are immediate and variable based on environmental abstraction, but through where they're happening in your development become cemented and concretized to the point that they're about permanence? So the things like the environment and the family structure. What are the things that are like the next layer of abstraction like that you start to get a little more plastic in how it functions? And where's the part where now you have this tool that's built up and you can use it mostly as a self-directed thing? Because part of this is also, I think there is some sort of point to where you get something similar or akin to free will. And before we get too far deep down that rabbit hole, I don't mean you can choose to do anything at any point in any time. I mean, you now have this whole utility that is the crux of your identity and is your set of tools and your set of equipment that you're built and to use and operate. That's this amalgamation of your personality and your environment and your family and your morphology and all these developmental things up to, like around age 26. And then at some point, I think you get enough mastery, or it concretizes enough that there isn't enough requisite change that happens after that that's part of the overall concretizing process. So it's almost like it's almost kind of like baking a cake to a point. So you get all those things going together, and it's all baking the cake, and then somewhere around age 26, I'm guessing, cake comes out of the oven, and now it's a cake. And now the question is, what do you do with the cake? You can't decide what kind of cake it is. Like, it's already baked. That's done. Like, you can't pull it back apart into its requisite components, make it eggs and flour. Like, you can't do that. It's a cake. It's done. It has the frosting. It has the strawberries, whatever the fuck it has. It has that, and it's done. You can't change that. But you can decide what to do with that cake. That's what I mean by I think there's a point where free will sort of like comes into play. And I think that might actually be part of the design, that part of the design is us getting concretized to that point where we have enough of these sort of tools and capabilities and adaptations that we're then supposed to use all these things for a specific purpose that is sort of like a purpose we decide to some degree. Because, like the things like your personality, your morphology, like your socio-economic environment, your family, like those things you don't decide. And even what's happening in like your first place where you start experimenting with making decisions, anywhere from like 6 to 16, it's like you're more rowing against the tide right there when you're trying to like make decisions about things, because there are so many things that are happening that are outside of your control and are part of this developmental baking process, and so many things are already baking that you can't modify the trajectory of the bake too much because you make a decision. But there is some point where I think the bake finishes, it's done, and at that point your choice on how to use the thing becomes orders of magnitude more important, more impactful, and more leverageable to you directly. But you have to understand what the cake is that you have to some extent and how it works. So that's kind of what I'm trying to figure out. Like, what are those factors? How are they measured? How do you understand the measurements in terms of how they interact and how they change the measurements of other things because of how they interact? Which things have primacy at what point to what degree? Which parts are, where do they happen in sort of like the a priori order of this calculation that determines who you're going to be, and at what point does it become something that it is like the finished cake and you get to use it. So something like that is part of what I'm trying to figure out. And really, I guess the main reasons that I'm trying to figure this out is because, one of the things people will say is, don't chase happiness. That's a fool's errand. And it's like, they're right. Chasing happiness is a fool's errand, but happiness is a measurement the same way that sadness is a measurement, right? If you do something and you feel sad or remorse or guilty, that is a sign to you that you are doing something wrong, right? So you should treat it as such. So when people say don't chase happiness, it's like they're kind of wrong, because if you're happy about something, it's a sign that you're doing something right. But you just have to have actual definitions of what you're talking about on happiness. Are you talking about like having fun or being happy? Because happiness is more like a vector of fulfillment, engagement, like you do something, there's this like satisfaction that's like the kind of satisfaction you only get from like delayed gratification activities, or when you're like fully engaged in something that is important and complicated and you feel like it matters and it like gets you going. Like, that's the kind of happy, quote unquote, I'm talking about. I'm not talking about like you had a few beers or you're out drinking with your friends. That's cool too, but like that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about specifically when you act as a human who is intended to manipulate your environment, and you are engaged in that direct manipulation, you will feel a sense of, yes, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. Yes, this is working. And then when you're feeling that, that's similar to happiness. So to some degree, you should chase that. So part of why I'm trying to figure all this shit out is because if you get enough understanding of personality and how the morphology and all the other stuff I've already said. If you get an idea of how that works and what it sort of makes a person become, and you can figure out what is the thing that this person is supposed to do, or at minimum, how are they supposed to do it, right? If you can figure that out and you can use that to give like people guidance and instruction, it's almost like if you can give them an instruction manual for themselves and it's accurate, right? You tell them, if you do activities that are of this type and you approach them in this way and you engage with them to this level, you will find more productivity, more success, and more happiness if you do these things like this in this way for these amount of times, this level of engagement. Like if you can give somebody that set of instructions because you understand who they are and how they work based on all those factors I was talking about, it's like there's a lot that really starts to open up about what humanity can become after that. So that's sort of why I'm asking like this question and trying to figure out. Like I said, I don't think I'm going to be able to figure out the actual proper definitions and the manipulation vectors. I don't think I'm going to be able to figure that out, but I think maybe what I can do, if I'm not crazy, I think maybe what I can do is put together enough of a sort of like synthesized philosophical outline that starts to give a more complete picture of how to conceptualize this problem. I think maybe I can do that, and then if I do that well enough, I think somebody after will maybe be able to take that and then start to actually discover the more scientific components about it and the more measurement related components about it. And then maybe eventually the person after that will be able to figure out, oh, and this is how we actually do it. So then maybe if I'm lucky, nobody ever has to live like I did ever again. That would be ideal. That's kind of what my whole like purpose is here. Because there's so many things about my life that had somebody understood who I was, how I was supposed to work, and how I was supposed to function, and what sort of things I was supposed to engage in, and why, and how, and like what things about me that were different from other people were normal and not weird or not odd. And I understood that because I was me and it was specific to me. Had somebody known that, shown those things to me as I was growing up, normalized them for me, sort of like socialized me to those ideas, and I started to understand, oh, like there is a paradigm of how I work. I can't do precisely what that person's doing because I'm not that person, right? Not so much blank slateism and all this crap. If I had that when I was younger, like I can't even imagine what the version of me like today at age 45 looks like. Like I can't even imagine. It's so fundamentally different from me. Like I can't even comprehend it. But at the same time, the thing I can comprehend is that it's vastly superior to me, whatever that is. Whatever it is, it's several orders of magnitude better than what I am. That I know for sure. So that's sort of what I'm trying to figure out. How do we make people not have to live the way we live now, which is we don't understand what we're supposed to be, what we're supposed to do, how or why. Like we have to stumble upon it if we're lucky. Like there's a way to figure this out and do this so that anybody can follow like a set of instructions. Like once they get there, you give them their body, you give them their personality, you give them all the things they're growing up with, and you say, oh, okay, here's your instruction manual. And you can read it and you can follow the steps and you can see they work. Dude, like the face of the planet would change. Absolutely, like completely, in ways that we can't even imagine. It would cause the world to change. Because I don't think normalizing or standardizing people to be more similar and less different is proper. I think we're properly different on purpose by design for a reason, built to do specific things. It's just we don't understand what those things are, how we do them, how they interact to a level of fidelity or understanding that we can do anything about it or with them. So that's sort of what I'm thinking about. That's what I'm trying to figure out. So that's why I'm just starting at what are the points? What are the things that are just built? What are the things that's the next layer on top? What are the things that's the layer after that? And how many layers are there till you get to the point where you stop adding ingredients to the cake? And at what point does the cake bake and it becomes a cake you can use, right? That's sort of what I'm trying to figure out. That's just really complicated. Yep, that's it.